for the students to come
Okay,
in.
sounds good.
So let's give them a few minutes and we can start, okay?
All right.
Professor, glad to see you again. I'm Juan, professor from UNAP, and I'm here to help you to translate the students' questions. And if you need something, please let me know. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
I give some instruction for the students, and then we can start. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
A ver, para los que se han ido conectando a la clase, ya está conectado el profesor Bala, al cual le vamos a dar unos minutos para que comience con la sesión de hoy. La clase, al ser en inglés, tiene la posibilidad de tener un traductor en línea, el cual, si ustedes no lo están viendo en este minuto, que debería estar de alguna manera escribiendo la traducción abajo, tiene que activarlo en la pestaña donde dice More o más, o en los tres puntitos que aparece en Zoom, y luego aparecen subtítulos, ¿ya? Si hacen clic ahí, debiesen poder ya estar viendo los subtítulos de los que estamos hablando, ¿bien? Va a dar espacio para ciertas preguntas. El profesor Vara dentro de su curso da espacio para ciertas preguntas, así que los invito a participar, a sacar provecho a la sesión. Si quieren hacer preguntas en inglés de manera directa, bienvenido. Si es que no se atreven, las pueden hacer por el chat y yo y algún otro profesor la podemos traducir de manera simultánea. ¿Ok? Okay, Bala, we are now ready to start. Please, you can introduce yourself and then we can start with the presentation.
Yeah, great. I have a couple of slides for that as well. So let me share my presentation. I don't think I have the permission, so if you could just let me share.
I don't have the permissions to give you like a host. No sé quién tiene permiso para.
Yo puedo poner, pero todos los participantes, voy a poner todos nomás, ¿ok?
Ok, vale.
Now you can try, please, Professor Bala.
Yeah. Can everyone see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that. And good evening, everybody. My name is Bala Balachandar. It's Jairam Balachandar, but I go by the abbreviated form of my last name, Bala. So please go ahead and call me Bala. And just a quick introduction about me. I am in Arizona State University in the business school, and I'm what is called a professor of practice. What that basically means in the US, we have these titles of professor of practice is for those individuals who've spent a bulk of their career in the industry. So I've spent more than 2+ decades, about 20+ years as a C-level executive. I used to be chief technology officer, used to be chief product officer in a number of different companies, and most of them in the ed tech space, educational technology space. And as a result, I have sort of extensive experience in strategy, digital transformation, which is obviously what this course is about, product management and development of software, especially commercial off-the-shelf software and applications. And so one of the things I decided to do about 4 or 5 years ago now that I wanted to step away from the corporate world, and I've always liked teaching, so I decided to teach. And I've been in Arizona State University for about 4 or 5 years now, teaching both undergraduate and graduate in various number of courses. So my experience has sort of shaped my teaching learning philosophy. And one of the things that I tend to do is because of my background, I want to make sure that whatever I'm teaching is relevant, right? And because one of the things is I go back a long time ago when I was a student, and sometimes when I was learning concepts, I would not, take it very seriously because I always thought, how is this going to help me in my future and in when I actually go get a job or whatever the case might be. And so sometimes I feel that if we can make something relevant to the students, they tend to pay more attention. And that is one way of sort of increasing the engagement, if you will. So one of the things that I always like to do is, I try to make my classes interactive. It's going to be a little hard because I'm speaking in English and you are all Spanish, but we will do our best and we will try with interpretations and translations and all that to the extent we can. I would like to make this highly engaging in terms of the topics and what we're going to be discussing. And what I really want to do is foster a culture where critical thinking is something that I think we all need to do, and it's probably one of the more important skills as you go further in your career. And I would like to sort of have an environment that can foster that, because if you think about what's happening these days with all the different technologies and how quickly you can get some information and how you can go to AI tools and get stuff, what I really think that we need to educate students is with the ability to think critically and not take anything at face value. So just because you're using an AI tool doesn't make it necessarily the right thing. So I want to make sure that students are inculcated with that critical thinking. And finally, I do want you to enjoy it, right? And the more you enjoy something, the better you retain and learn. So I want this to be fun. So that's essentially what I sort of emphasize and what my background helps me do. And so let's sort of move forward now in terms of what I want to cover in this particular class, right? So clearly, you're going to be learning about digital transformation in the course, and we will definitely touch on that in one or two of the lectures that I'll be teaching, and I'm sure others who are going to be teaching will cover as well. But what we're going to be doing this week in this lecture is sort of lay the foundations for digital transformation. So the things that I would like to sort of discuss today are the different aspects of business models, value propositions, sort of some of the strategic forces that typically a company may go through. What are those, and how do different companies deal with those types of things? How do they come up with the business strategy as well as technology strategy, right? How do you leverage technologies that are out there? Because I would argue that in this day and age, almost every company is becoming like a technology company in some sense, right? So there's so much of technology that is disrupting things. So that's something that we need to look at. And then finally, we'll do a quick review on some of the indicators that you may want to think about and what we typically call key performance indicators. And then how do you sort of understand, because the key oftentimes in any transformation, and particularly so in digital transformation, is how do you go from your current state to the to-be state, right? So how do you sort of understand what your current state is? And that is by looking at how you go through your processes and how do you currently do your processes, and how do we identify areas of improvement. And so we will sort of have a very quick overview of process diagrams. How do you understand them? How can you create them? And that's essentially what we are going to be focusing on for the rest of this class, and which I think are sort of the foundational aspects. Because if you think about, and I'll very briefly mention it, we'll cover this in detail, but if you think about digital transformation, it's not just about technology transformation. It's just not about using technology. It is about you reimagining your business, your current business, through the lens of all those disruptive technologies. And in order for you to do that, you really need to understand business models. You need to understand value propositions and so on and so forth, which is essentially what we are going to be looking at today, right? And so let's sort of try this out. I want you, all of you, to put in the chat what you think is a business model, all of you have heard the term of business model. I'm sure everybody has got a definition. And please, before you Google it, you can always Google it later. But before you Google it, just put in what you think is the business model. What it means to you, and then let's have a quick discussion. And I want to do this because I want to sort of illustrate a particular point. So please bear with me while we do this. So I'll give you about a minute or so, not too much time, just about couple of minutes, and I may have to translate, or I may have to ask one of you to help me, Professor Juan, in terms of translating it. So I just want to, let's at least get about 8 to 10 of them, and then we'll have a discussion about this.
Bien, ahí el profesor Bala da un espacio para que ustedes vayan incorporando qué es lo que ustedes entienden sobre el nuevo modelo de negocio o modelos de negocio. Incorporen eso en el chat, no lo busquen en Google, sino lo que se les viene a la cabeza con los conocimientos que tienen. Y vamos a abrir un poquito de discusión ahí.
So somebody has said it's a way to do things. Good, step-by-step processes. Let's see if we have a couple of more.
Pueden hacerlo en español si quieren y podemos traducirlo también y se puede hablar en inglés, no hay ningún problema si quieren.
Okay, I guess I translated some of them. For some people, it's the first time. Don't worry about it. No worries if you don't know what it is. We'll talk about it in detail. Excellent, how a company creates and captures value. And so that's good. And Professor Juan, do you want to just tell me a couple of things in Spanish? If I didn't read it, I would appreciate it.
Here is something like it's a form to represent the strategy of the company. Is the business model is the companies do to earn money and sale and who create and deliver value, sustainable value.
Excellent. All right, so that's good. So let's sort of. I think this is a good representation of what, and most of you are definitely in the right area in terms of value capture and so on, and that's an integral part of it. But the interesting thing, the reason I was sort of asking you to do this, is that a number of us have certain ideas. And there are certain commonality between some of our ideas, but there are also certain aspects that are different about it, right? And which is typically the case when you often come across a phrase that we use a lot, but sometimes we struggle a little bit to say we all have the same definition, right? So that could be sometimes a challenge. And when you are going through transformations and when you're really thinking about it, and you as a group in a company are having a discussion, especially around business models, it's absolutely critical to make sure everybody's on the same page as to what we mean by business model. And why do we care about business models? Because oftentimes in digital transformation, it is the successful companies often change their business model when they do the digital transformation. So oftentimes people focus only on the innovation of their products and services, but successful companies actually innovate on their business models as well. And that's why we want to sort of take some time and get a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about business models. And so the most comprehensive one, if you will, is at a very high level, and I think a couple of students got it. It's about how organizations create, delivers, and captures value. But however, the key to really think about the key components of a business model is the following: customer segmentation. Who are we really talking about? What's the value proposition, or what is it that we are offering? How do we get to our customers, the channels? What are our relationship with the customers? And we'll go through all these in details: revenue streams, key activities, resources, cost structure, partners, and so on. And this was conceived maybe about 7-10 years ago by two folks. They both are out of the university in Switzerland, Alexander Osterwalder and Yves Pignier, where they came up with this notion of a business model canvas. And it's a very visual, easy way to wrap your head around what do we mean when we say business model, right? And so at the core of it, the heart of all business models, as some of you have already said, is about value, right? How does a particular company create value? And so what is the value proposition, right? And then the key thing in that is who are our customers? How do we segment the customers, right? So that's the customer segmentation here. And then how do we reach those customers? That's through the channels that we may have, and then we get into lots of questions, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these questions. But then we get into what is our relationship as a company with our customers? Is it predominantly transactional? Is it more recurring on a regular basis? Is it that we have a very close relationship with them and where they almost treat us as partners, and so on and so forth, right? So that's your sort of the customer-facing side of the business model, right? You've got the value proposition, segmentation, relationship channels, and all that. Then we get into sort of inward looking, if you will, for lack of a better phrase, on what are our key activities? What is it that we do in order for us to realize this particular business value, right? And what do we do in that? And what are the key resources, right? Obviously people, but what else, right? What are some of the things that we want to look at from a resource perspective? And by now we all recognize and realize that it's very difficult for one single company to be the sole provider. In other words, most companies now have partners. And who are our key partners? Whether they are suppliers, whether they are manufacturing, or whatever the case is. So that's your partners here, right? So those are your key things. And finally, how do we make money? What is our revenue stream? Where are we getting that from? And what is our cost structure? So in order for us to generate this revenue, how are we doing in our costs? Are we actually spending more than what we are earning? And a lot of companies do that in the beginning of their career, so to speak, right? In the startup era, that you typically have a higher cost structure than what you're getting in, and so on. But how is this whole thing shaping up in terms of the equations between cost structure and revenue? So a good business model will use this as a canvas, if you will, and start asking everybody the following type of questions, right? So for example, in our value proposition, we ask some basic things. What value are we delivering to the customers, right? And by the way, which one of these problems are we trying to solve, so to speak, right? And if we have multiple market segments, which bundles of products and services are we offering? Are we offering the same product and services to all our segments, or are we customizing it based on this, right? And so what are some of the needs of the customer, and so on? So you get the idea. The more you can answer these types of questions, the better your understanding of your business model is going to be. And the more you understand your current business model, you will get to start seeing opportunities for innovation in your business model that will help you during your digital transformation, right? I'm not going to go through each of these questions, but I would like you to sort of understand that, out of these, in all these 9 areas, so to speak, you have pertinent questions that you can ask, right? And so sort of get into that. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing throughout this lecture and probably subsequent lectures is to illustrate by taking a fairly well-known company, right? So I may give a lot of examples. I may use different companies to illustrate certain points. So one of the things I thought I would do is look at. I haven't done this, by the way. I just picked this up from literature. But here is sort of Airbnb. I'm hoping almost everybody, all the students are familiar with Airbnb. If you have not stayed in one, you probably know of someone who stayed, and perhaps you may have been a host in some areas. So think of the value proposition of Airbnb, right? So the first and foremost, now guests can stay in private homes during their travel. And so one of the things you may think about in terms of customer segmentation is I've got people who are traveling with families. I've got people who are business travelers. I've got people who are globetrotters, right? I've got lots of this, and I've got people who want to save some dollars. And so they may be the budget traveler. So that could be my customer segmentation. And the value proposition is that I can often have that it's less expensive than hotels. And especially if there is a family traveling and they're able to cook and so on and so forth, it becomes overall less of an expensive trip, right? Or you may say, from a host perspective, you are now able to monetize your home by either completely renting it out, or you can rent per certain parts of your home, right? So that's the value proposition for the host. Obviously, you've got different value propositions for different people. The ones who are the guests, you've got a value proposition. For the host, you've got another one, right? And similarly, your customer segmentation has different types of guests and hosts as well, right? And how do you sort of reach the channel, if you will, for all the customers? Well, one is through word of mouth, right? I may have gone to one of these Airbnbs and I've been using them for about close to 10, 15, 12 years now. And I say, hey, I had a good experience. Or I can also say, hey, that particular one, I had a poor experience, right? It can go either way. But word of mouth is probably one of the things. And then, of course, social media and typical marketing and other marketing techniques that you may be using as your channel, right? And obviously the platform, right? So in terms of relationship, it is predominantly a self-service type of thing with obviously 24/7 support if you get into challenge, right? And what are some of the key activities? Well, you're a tech company. You are building a platform that connects the host with the guest. So what you want to do is you have to do platform development and maintenance, right? And you also have to get a good understanding of what your users want, what the research associated with that is, and so on, right? And you want to make sure you're developing specific markets, local markets. So how you're doing it in Madrid or Barcelona might be very different from Santiago or New York or whatever the case may be, right? And so you have that, and you've got the resources and the partners is you've got a bunch of partners. You're not doing this by yourself, right? If you're Airbnb, obviously you've got the whole payment mechanism, right? How they sort of manage the payment side of it. You've got the PayPal folks, you've got the investors, you've got the travel communities, and you obviously need insurances and so on and so forth, right? And you may have to work with regulatory things, and you may have to work with the government. You may have to lobby and have lobbyists to say it's okay to have Airbnb, because right now in some cities they're facing a backlash, right? Because people feel that prices have gone up, the real estate prices have gone up so high because a lot of them want to buy and turn it around as an Airbnb guest. So you've got that challenge. And so, for example, from a revenue side, Airbnb makes money, the host makes money, a percentage of the overall share. And obviously, from a cost structure perspective, the cost structure for the platform and so on, but there are also cost structure for the host, right? So think about a number of different offshoots of this ecosystem. Now there are cleaning companies that a number of Airbnb hosts outsource their cleaning, so that between two guests, you have a clean apartment and so on and so forth. So you've got this entire ecosystem that's sort of has been built on what was essentially an idea about 10, 15 years ago, a relatively new one, right, at that time. So I'm going to pause here and just check on a couple of things. Hopefully my speed in English is okay. I can slow down if I have to. And if there are any questions on what we have covered so far.
Thanks, Professor. A ver, para los que se han ido conectando, está la posibilidad de colocar el traductor en línea. Estoy leyendo en el chat que varios están con problemas con el idioma. Igual le voy a pedir al profesor que hable un poquito de inglés más lento para que puedan entenderlo igual. De todas maneras, activen esa sección. Lo pueden hacer en los 3 puntitos que hay más abajo, donde dice More o más, y ahí aparecen subtítulos, ¿ya? Este es el momento para hacer preguntas. Si es que alguno tiene alguna duda con respecto a business models, ¿verdad? El lienzo Canvas, doy el espacio para que lo puedan hacer por el chat y lo traducimos, o lo pueden hacer directamente con el profesor. Professor, please, if you can speak a little bit slow, will be better for the students. Perfect.
Okay.
And now I'm asked for the students if they have some questions by chat or directly with you. Okay. ¿Alguna duda? Vamos a dar unos pequeños minutos y si no,
Profesor,
continuamos con
yo
la
tengo
charla.
una duda,
Dime,
no sé si
Ignacio.
me la podría traducir, que es la siguiente. ¿Cómo nosotros podemos determinar qué tan específicos tienen que ser los detalles, en este caso del business model?
Perfecto.
Porque cuando yo estuve haciendo este trabajo, justamente ya nos tocó, en este caso, utilizar este sistema, pero igual me costaba determinar si ser muy específico y se alargara demasiado el business model. Quizá iba a ser como demasiada información y no sé hasta qué punto tengo que dejarlo, por decirlo así.
Okay, Professor, the question for Ignacio is how specific is you need to build this Canvas business models in which part of or in all the elements? How specific you need to explain the role or the element for the business model?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say reasonably high level and not too detailed, but enough to sort of really understand what is it that you're doing, right? So in other words, if you think about certain areas, for example, let's take customer segmentation. It is actually good to make sure you're segmenting the market, right? So for example, this particular example talks about budget travelers, talks about business travelers. You could have said all travelers as your customer segment, right? But that doesn't really give you enough visibility or insight into your different market segment, different customer segments. So saying travelers is too high, right? So you have to be specific enough to at least say there are different types of segments, travelers, budget, family, but you don't have to go down to the level of detail saying, I've got different types of budget travelers. I've got budget travelers who want to spend less than $1,000. I have budget travelers who want to spend less than 500. I would say that's a level too much, right? So you want to be at enough specificity where you can actually gain some insight about your current business knowledge, business model, but at the same time, not be too caught up in the weeds. So it's a little bit of an experience thing that unfortunately there is no right set. You have to be at this level. It comes a little bit with the more you do it, right? The more you will have a better understanding of what level of specificity, but enough specificity for you to get insights about your business model, but not too much of detail where you get bogged down by the detail and you're not able to pull yourself up. Remember that this is still a strategic exercise, right? You want to really understand your business model well enough so that you can figure out how to innovate on it, how it evolves as we go through transformation, which we'll talk a little bit, and that's that level that you need to look at. Hope that answered the question. Great question.
Thanks, profesor. Ignacio, no sé si lograste entender la
Sí,
respuesta.
sí, lo entendí. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thanks, professor.
Great. Any
Another
other
question?
or can I sort of move on?
We don't have questions in the chat. Maybe 1 minute for another question, and you can start again.
Good evening, professor. I have a question.
Yeah.
When you create the business model canvas, which key is the most important in his experience? For example, the value proposition, the cost structure, something like that.
I would say all of them. And that's why we have this canvas, because you want to make sure you've got all the 9 addressed, right? But to your point, yeah, I mean, each one is important, right? If I have a good value proposition, but I have no idea about my costs, that's not a good situation to be in. If I have pretty good idea of value proposition, pretty good idea of customer segment, but I have no idea of how I'm going to get revenue streams, how I'm going to make money, that is also not a good situation. So the idea is to have a view into all of them, all these 9 components. And that's why the canvas is quite invaluable, because it sort of puts a framework or a structure for you rather than you trying to figure out what I need to emphasize on in a business model. Okay.
Hi,
All
good
right.
evening. Hi, good evening.
Hi.
One question.
Yes.
Do we have to follow any order to define every point in the business model canvas?
Yeah, I would almost always start with what am I offering, what my value proposition is, and then go to customer segmentation. And then I would work on what is my relationship with my customers, what is the channel that I'm getting to my customers. So I'll sort of start with the right. Then I go to my left side to say what are my processes, what are my activities, who are my partners, and so on. And then based on all that information, I'll have a better idea of where my revenue and cost is coming from. Okay.
Okay.
All right, great. So let's now move on to the next sort of thing that I want you to understand in business models, which is that it's not static. What I mean by that is it will constantly evolve, right? And so a business model of a company isn't always the same. In fact, I would argue, if you think about transformations that all companies go through, they will evolve their business model. And I thought I would start illustrate this with an example. We all know about Amazon. We probably have ordered hundreds of stuff from Amazon in terms of how we shop. And remember that the evolution of Amazon was that it was meant to be an online bookstore, right? That was what it started with. It was an online bookstore. But then it slowly evolved into e-commerce platform for everything. And then they got into, and this is an interesting thing, because if you think about customer relationship in the previous slide that we talked about, for a long time, Amazon was transactional in nature. Their relationship with their customer was transactional. What I mean by that is I go, I buy, I get out. And if I want to go again, if I want to buy something again, I go in, I buy, I get out. But then they said, you know what, I actually think we have to evolve that particular customer relationship side of things. And then they came out with this concept of Amazon Prime, right? Where you pay a yearly subscription. And for that yearly subscription, you get some benefits. You obviously get a lot of free shipping. You get expedited shipping free sometimes. You get, your media like video streaming and so on and so forth, right? So you've got all those things. And then, of course, they became one of the early pioneers in cloud computing. How did they get there? Well, in order for them to do what they had to do, if you think about their key activities and key processes, they had to build an infrastructure in terms of technology infrastructure, but they had to do it in a very efficient form so that they could keep their cost structure low, right? And so one of the things they developed is competency in the whole Amazon Web Service or cloud computing, right? Where they can, you can scale and you can do. And what they realized was that in itself, they can actually make revenue of. So that became a new revenue stream. In fact, it is one of their most profitable revenue things. If you think about Amazon, I think I don't remember the latest figures, but at one point, 40% of their profit came from AWS, right? And so once again, an innovation in terms of evolving and changing the business model. And then, of course, they got into the creation of Alexa and Echo and so on and so forth, right? So if you think about their evolution in the last, I guess now 30 odd years or so, right? They first started with a product and they expanded that product range. Then they came up with something around customer loyalty, right? The Amazon Prime, if you will. And then they came up with cloud computing, and that is, in fact, were the pioneers in it. They were the first, and Microsoft and Google and everybody now is, has caught up a little bit, but they were still playing catch up for quite some time. And then, of course, the whole smart home technology like Alexa and Echo and so on and so forth. And they will continue to evolve, and they will continue. I mean, AI is going to, get into it, and you know how they have started shipping, like using drones and so on and so forth, and they're constantly innovating, and because of that, they're constantly transforming their business, and so their business model will keep evolving as we move forward, right? So that is something that I wanted to make sure you all understood from a business model perspective, that we, it's not a static thing. In fact, I would argue that a company that is undergoing digital transformation would, in some shape or form, evolve their business model, right? So if you sort of now move on, if you remember the foundational things that we are going to cover today, we covered business model, and that's taken me quite some time, but I think it's worth it because oftentimes it's not covered in as much of detail as one should. So hopefully you have now had a good handle on business models, and we'll move on to the next foundational thing. And we talked a little bit about it, or at least alluded to it when we talked about business models, which is this whole thing about value proposition. And what are we really talking about when we talk about creating value and so on? And that's clearly identifying the benefits for the customers, and those benefits typically that the customer is willing to pay for, right? That's an important aspect of that, right? So if you think about a values proposition statement, what you really want to do is have a strong customer focus associated with it. It has to be for the customer, not inside looking in type of thing, but really looking for the customer. It needs to be relevant. What problem are you trying to solve for that customer? How relevant is that problem that you're thinking about, right? So if I sort of want to give an example about Amazon AWS, one of the challenges that all companies were facing was the fact that sometimes if I have to scale my infrastructure, I wanted it to be flexible because I may be in a seasonal business, right? If I'm a e-commerce provider, chances are during Christmas and other festivals, my production will go up, but then it'll go down. I mean, my volume will go up and spike, but it'll go down during the rest of the year. I don't want to invest in hardware for just 10 days, but I have to incur the cost for the entire year. So that is a very strong problem that people used to have. So the ability to go up and spin down became highly relevant, right? What is your unique differentiation? What is your unique selling proposition, right? What is it, what as we call it as USP? What makes you different compared to your competitors? Well, in what way are you different? And we'll talk about certain examples as we go further along in this course, but you want to be very clear that you have a differentiator, right? And how do you sort of quantify the value? Value should not be very vague. It should be quantifiable, right? So those are some of the things that you want to think about from a value proposition. And yes. Sorry, I thought, was that a question or can I? Might have been somebody else.
No.
Yeah. Okay. So, let's once again take an example. I'm not sure how these red lines came up, but that's okay. That's all right. So the company that I'm going to be talking about is Netflix. And if you remember, I don't know whether this was how it was in Chile, but it was certainly how it was in the United States about 20 years or so ago. When Netflix initially came into existence, the infrastructure in the US was not good enough for you to stream movies, right? Because if you think about the name Netflix, Flix, of course, the movies in those days, and net was through the internet, but the very few people had really good internet. You had the last mile problem where even if you had decent internet, you paid for it, but the last mile was always slow. So you really didn't have a great streaming experience. So what they did was they initially came up with DVDs that they would mail you, right? You would actually get DVDs in the mail, and you take your DVD, you would watch it, and then when you're done with it, you would just put it back and you would ship it back. You would just drop it in your mailbox, and the mail guy would pick it up and send it back. And so it was, DVD. Now, there were other video companies, right? Blockbuster was the most popular one and probably the biggest one. And so the question was, so how is it different, right? What is the value that Netflix was talking about when they sent you the DVDs? Well, it's convenience, right? So in other words, if I had to go rent a video from Blockbuster, depending on where I lived, I may have to go about a mile, or I may have to go to 7, 8, 10 miles in order for me to go pick up a video. And now I can just be sitting at home. I just say, I want to watch this video. 2 days later, the movie comes in, or 1 day later, and you go do that. Now, there was a certain element of risk, right? Because there wasn't what we think of as instant gratification in those days. You're not going to, you have to plan a little bit. So it is not like if I suddenly want to watch a movie tonight because I've got a bunch of friends with me, I may not have been able to use Netflix, but with a little bit of planning on the part of the customer, you could plan it in such a way saying, if I knew two people were, if I had friends coming in a couple of days, I may have had 4 or 5 different DVDs ordered, because I could just do that. And so that was the initial start. After the infrastructure started improving, they came up with the online streaming, and there the value proposition was you can watch unlimited TV shows, you could watch movies anytime, anywhere. It doesn't matter where you are. You're traveling and you're in a hotel, you could use your Netflix ID and password, and you could just watch it at any point and not necessarily watch something that was on the TV in the hotel room or whatever the case may be, right? And then one of the things that they started was saying was that there was a lot of competition, right? And so they realized that they needed to differentiate or come up with a different value proposition. And so they went into original content creation. And so now I would argue Netflix does a lot more original content. Obviously, it still has movies, but they're sort of known for this now. And in fact, every year, if you look at the different award things like Oscar and Grammys and so on, they have quite a few of that. So here is a classic example of how even the value proposition keeps changing over the period of time, right? So once again, it is not something that remains static, right? So now let's move on to the next foundational thing that you want to understand. And so this, by the way, this theory is, I would say now at least 50 years old now, but it is still has withstood the test of time, if you will. And that's the seminal work done by Michael Porter out of Harvard, and talks about competitive forces, right? It talks about the fact that every company that is playing in this particular sector or whatever the thing might be goes through 5 competitive forces. First and foremost, it's the rivalry between the different companies in that. So for example, now Amazon, since it plays in so many different places, it may have different competitors, but in the space, in the area of cloud computing, they have Microsoft and Google and Oracle, and they're all now rivals that they play in that space, right? So you've got that particular power. So sometimes competition could be very fierce, in which case typically what happens is that it tends to get into somewhat of a low margin business. If the competition isn't very high, then you have more pricing power and you tend to have higher margin business. I mean, there are exceptions to that, but in general, that's some of the things you want to understand is how competitive is your space and what are some of the things that you're looking at. Then you got other threats or other forces that are sort of acting on your industry, so to speak. And those are, let's talk about 2 of them because they could be sort of, sometimes people get confused. But you have this notion of new entrants and threat of substitutes. So in other words, I can take the hotel or hospitality industry, and if you think about hotels at that time, all they were really worried about, the Hiltons of the world were worried about Marriott, and Marriott was worried about Sheraton and so on. And sometimes they would just acquire one of their competitors and become bigger. And now all of a sudden you've got a new entrant into that mix. And sometimes you will have companies that will play in both of these forces, right? And so Airbnb was not a traditional competitor. It was a new entrant into this mix. So here it is, a company now that is providing you alternatives. So it's a combination of substitute and new entrants, right? So the substitute is an alternative. An alternative is that I now can stay, if I'm traveling, at someone's home as opposed to staying at a hotel. And so because of that substitute force acting and the fact that it's acting pretty highly, then you can have now new entrants that are coming into the picture. Another classic example is Uber, right? It completely disrupted the taxi business, right? So it's very similar. If you think about Airbnb, what Airbnb did is what Uber essentially did to transportation in terms of cabs, right? So you now have an alternative way of looking at it. And now that's getting disrupted again. How? We've got Waymo. I don't know whether you're familiar with Waymo, and Tesla is trying to do these automated driving where now, you don't need a driver, right? So you can just now hail this Waymo cab and it'll come in. And I took one for the first time about a week or so ago, and it's an amazing experience. right? There's nobody in. It just, you use your phone, it comes in, you pulls up, and you get in, and it goes and drops you off. And so that again is it's a new entrant into that industry, right? And then finally, you've got the notion of buyer bargaining power and supplier power. So in other words, how much can a particular company really leverage its buying power? So if how can I improve my buying power when I can actually be the 800-pound gorilla, the biggest guy for you as a customer. If you're supplying something, let's say you have T-shirts or something like that you have done in some creative way, and if some company like Walmart comes in and says, "I want to stock all my stores with your T-shirt," you're going to say, "I'm going to give you the best deal in town because it's Walmart." It's automatically increasing your volume like nobody's business. And so you've got that as that. And then the flip side of it is the supplier, right? And I know there's somebody has raised a hand. So what I will do is let me just illustrate this with an example, and then we can pause, and then we can chat about the questions and do that. And so quickly, let me just quickly tell you, I picked Apple because Apple does a terrific job in most of these things. And if you think about Apple's ecosystem strategy, right? I mean, if you think about Apple, in a lot of ways, it's kind of close, right? So, I can't really have different flavors of Apple operating system, iOS system running in different phones like Android does, right? Android is a different model, but I can't do that in Apple. It's somewhat close, and it works fantastically if you're in that ecosystem. But if you're outside of that ecosystem and you just want to do certain things in that ecosystem, it's not that helpful or that great. But what it does, if you think about the ecosystem strategy and you think about the whole, five forces, that ecosystem is so good that it is preventing people from getting in. So think about how it sort of grew, the way it grew in the last 50, 20 years, and not so much from how they transformed from, it used to be called Apple Computers, if you remember the name, and now it's just Apple, how they transformed from a computer company to a lot more is an interesting thing, right? Because Apple's iPod was not the first MP3 player. There were a lot of other MP3 players out there, but you know what they did? They came up with the iTunes along with the iPods and had struck deals with different music labels that no other MP3 player did. All the MP3 players were just saying is, I'm going to focus on my hardware, and that's all I'm going to be doing. And they became bit players, right? Whereas Apple, in its infinite wisdom, and this was innovative even in their business model, they came up with software and hardware and a combination of that ecosystem. So now it's a high barrier to entry for a lot of companies, right? Not everybody could do that and strike deals with music label companies and so on. And, Apple obviously didn't have their own chip in that iPod. They actually got it from other suppliers. And their leverage was very high because it's Apple. They can go in and place orders to this relatively smaller chip manufacturer and say, I'm going to give you millions of orders. And so obviously they have tremendous leverage of them, right? Now, here's an interesting thing from a buying power. You would normally think that, because Apple is higher priced and it's a higher margin business, it may have, it may be in a situation where the buyer may have strong thing, but not necessarily with Apple, because they do such a fabulous job of brand loyalty that people are willing to pay $1,000 for new phones as soon as it comes up. People are lining up in the street to do that. So you have reduced buyer power as well, right? And so now in this ecosystem, what they do is they create different products that all work very well. You've got a computer, you've got an iPod device, you've got iTunes, then you became iPhones, and then you got the headphones for the iPhones, and so on and so forth. And they have done a fabulous job of creating complementary products where the threat of substitute is also low, right? And the way they shifted the whole competitive space is they focused on the user experience, and they're known for their design, right? How friendly it is and how easy it is for even novices to really operate their device. So they shifted the competition to more at a user experience level rather than just, and the entire experience rather than just features, right? And so they did a fabulous job of dealing with all those five forces. I'm going to pause now. I know there was a question somewhere, when I was talking in the previous slide, but I'll pause and, entertain questions.
Sí, ahora hay espacio para preguntas. Creo que alguien levantó la mano. Es el momento para hacer la pregunta. Y
Buenas
creo que
tardes.
Jaime... Dale.
Good evening, Professor. I have a question about the forces. My question is about, in your experience, what do you think is the most common or strongest force of these five?
So it's interesting you asked that question. I think, there is one sort of disadvantage, if you will, of Porter's five forces. It sort of assumes that all the companies in that industry will behave in a certain way and they will all go through those same forces. But if there's a certain company that is very innovative and it uses disruptive technology and it disrupts that industry, Porter doesn't do an extremely good job of explaining that, right? So if you sort of look at it, it's a little traditional in the way that he addressed it. I would say to you that, in the current world, the way we are today, with all the different disruptions that are happening because of technology, the two forces that I would watch for is, threat of new entrants and threat of substitution, because that is what seems to be really disrupting the industry, if any industry for that matter, right? And so, for example, especially in the world of AI now, with so many things that are potentially going to get disrupted, I would worry about those two things, right? And those would tell me a little bit more about how the disruption is. So in some ways, really focus on that to look at. For example, I just read an article the other day that Google's AI, for the first time, they do drug discovery, right? For the first time in the US, they are going to do human trial on a drug that was exclusively done by AI. So think about that now for a second, right? So if I'm a pharma company and I do drug discovery, I'm Merck, I'm GlaxoSmithKline, I'm all those guys. All of a sudden now, I've never thought Google to be my competitor. But it could happen in 3 to 5 years that they can be competitor to you, right? So those two things with disruptive technologies is what I would pay attention to. Hope that answers the question.
Yes, sir. Thanks.
Sure.
Another question, Jaime Araya. No sé si quieres leer tú tu pregunta o la hago yo directamente.
Buenas tardes, profesor. Yo la puedo leer.
Dale.
Professor, how do you think the pandemic affect the business model of technology companies regarding the value proposition toward the customer and their speed of adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So the pandemic affected in lots of different ways. So think about through the lens of supplier, for example. The supply chain got completely disrupted, right? So in those times, the supplier force, if you had one, became a lot less because you realized that you were sort of dependent on your suppliers, and if something happened to the suppliers, then you were out of luck, so to speak, right? And so that is one way of doing it. But if you just think about the value proposition of your company, and if you were a company that really dependent on what I think of as brick and mortar, right? Where people come to your place and sort of look at, to deal with you, that came down quite a bit. If my business was relying on in-person relationship, that went down, and that's why you saw companies like Zoom and all the other companies that were out there just skyrocketed in terms of its valuation because they provided an alternative, right? So what could be that's a substitute. So what I could do in person, now I could do because of advances in video conferencing, I could do that in person, right? I mean, instead of in person, I could do that on the phone. So that was a substitute. So all of a sudden, companies that were well poised in that area became more valuable than those perhaps who were not in that and who had sort of missed the boat on that, right? So each of these things affects in different ways. Those are just two examples. Was there anything specific that you were looking for, or did I answer that question?
Ahí, Jaime, no sé si había alguna duda más específica o con eso ya el profesor respondió tu pregunta.
Sí, con eso me basta. Era más bien una pregunta general.
It was a general question, Professor. It's good your answer. Thanks for
Okay, excellent. All right. Should I move on, or is there another question?
No, we don't have more questions in our chat. Maybe another, ¿algún otro alumno que quiera hacer alguna pregunta? No. Oh, here. Avisa.
Okay. All right.
Hi,
So now let's
Professor.
get. Oops, sorry.
Hi.
Yeah.
Don't worry. I have a question. Did you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but can the business model canvas be adapted for non-profits or public institutions?
Great question. Yes, I absolutely. I think you will have less of, if you think about even for not-for-profit or government organizations, you do need all those aspects of it, right? So even revenue, even though you may not worry directly about revenue stream per se, but think about if I'm a government, I need to understand how I'm going to get my revenue through taxes or whatever the case may be. I still have to worry about that. If I'm not for profit, I'm probably raising funds, right? If I'm not raising funds, I don't have enough money to do that. So absolutely, you can use this for that, right? You may tweak it a little bit, but you would absolutely, you can use it. Great question.
Thank you.
All right. All right. So let me move on and cover the 3 or 4 other things that I wanted to cover. So clearly, the way we are sort of, the world we live in, there's so much of disruption from technologies, and we will actually spend an entire lecture on exponential technologies and disruption and some of the innovation models and so on and so forth. But let's briefly touch on it in terms of strategy and basically how do you use technology to support your overall business strategy, right? So the key things that I have to think about is that my technology strategy has to be aligned with my overall business strategy, right? So that has to have that. The second is it's not enough if I have the strategy, I need to make sure I can execute on it, right? And so I need to have a decent handle on what my capabilities are and whether I'm in a position to actually execute on that. And then, of course, I may have to think about what technology am I using and how do I go about implementing it and so on. And so this becomes a very critical component when you think about digital transformations, is that, while I mentioned that it's not just about technology, but technology does play a pretty important role, right? So you want to make sure you have a good handle on that. So let's quickly illustrate this through one of the companies that did a pretty good job of it. So if you think about Starbucks, and they're in the coffee business, and and you would say, why do they need technology? But they want to make sure that they are giving the customers a great experience. And one of the things that they do that with is through their mobile app, right? You've got a lot of you may have it already. If not, if you're a frequent Starbucks, um, sponsor, then I would suggest that you download it. And what it does is it makes things a whole lot easier, right? You can just order something and pay for it during the app and just go pick it up. In fact, I've got a personal story that is interesting in the sense that, so I was at an airport. I was traveling somewhere, and I don't know if that's is true in Chile. In US, all the Starbucks in the airports are so crowded. There's always a long line. And it was funny. I was standing in line when I suddenly realized, you know what? Maybe it'll be quicker if I just order it through the phone. So what I did was took my mobile app, downloaded Starbucks app, logged in, and placed an order, and it was a lot faster than waiting in line and going and picking up. So that level of integration that they've thought through, because it's not just, it is just not about giving you a way to order a cup of coffee. It is the fact that it needs to get to that shop, that store that you're currently are going to pick it up from. It has to get into their line. The baristas have to make coffee, so it has to make sure that it flows into that queue of orders, and then it needs to get fulfilled. So you've got this whole chain, and we'll talk about this value chain at some point, and that you have to get through and do that. And so that's a great way of leveraging technology. And not only do they do that, they also give you a loyalty program. So if you use it for 10 times, your 11th cup of coffee is free, and so on. So they motivate you to continue to use that, right? And they use a lot of analytics to say, hey, you seem to like, mocha or whatever it is, or double shot of espresso. So it automatically, when you order it next time through the app, it says, do you want a double shot of espresso, or whatever the case is, right? This is understanding your customer, understanding their preferences, really integrating everything. So their technology strategy is extremely well aligned to the overarching company strategy. So even though they are in the coffee selling business or other beverage selling business, they leverage technology extremely well, right? So moving on to the last couple of things that I wanted to talk about is this whole notion of performance indicators, right? So often called key performance indicators or KPIs. And so, one of the things that we always say is that if you sort of don't know how well you're doing currently, and when you're in the transformation business, how will you know whether you're doing a better job after you've gotten yourself transformed, right? So typically what you want to measure certain things, especially those that are related to a certain business objective, right? And so these indicators, performance indicators, often tell you how well you're doing, right? And so the key thing is that they have to be quantifiable. It can't be vague. It can't say something like, I want to improve retention, right? Customer retention. The fact that, if I come to your site and then I don't come back anymore, you've lost me as a customer. How do I retain these types of customers? So that's customer retention. You can't say, I want to improve it. That's not a good KPI. You want to say something like, I want to improve my customer retention by 7% over the next 1 year, right? It has to be very specific goal. It has to be quantifiable. I can track it over time, and I can compare it with this year's retention compared to last year's retention, and so on. And I can sort of be able to say that if I'm in the 8th month and my goal was 7% and I'm at 1%, chances are I'm not going to get to that, right? So you want to make sure that you can track it, and if you have to intervene and do some course correction, you're able to do that reasonably quickly. And it also forms sort of a very good way to communicate with your employees as to what are the things we are absolutely essential for us to measure, and how are we tracking as a company. And this becomes an easy way to communicate with employees that you're giving them something actionable that they can work with, right? So KPIs can be operational, KPIs can be strategic, and KPIs can also be what we call leading indicators and lagging indicators. So for example, I can talk about customer retention again. And if I'm measuring customer retention at the end of every month, it is telling me how I'm doing, right? How I did in the last month. So it is what is called lagging indicator. So it is after the fact, right? What could be a leading indicator? One hypothesis I can have is to say, if let's say I'm in the world of online products, and if I see that there is hardly any usage throughout the month, chances are I'm going to have a retention problem, right? So the active usage becomes a leading indicator. So in other words, I can see it is acting as a leading proxy for me for customer retention. If there are no usage of the system, then that value is not really going on, and so there is a higher degree of chance that somebody is going to move away from your product, right? So that's that. So they both are very important, leading as well as lagging. So you want to sort of think about it from that perspective. So one of the things, again, like the rest of the things, I thought it would be good to get into sort of an illustration. And Uber obviously got into other things other than just their rides, right? So they got into now delivery and Uber Eats and so on and so forth. And so one of the things they wanted to do was to make sure that one of their value proposition was to provide more visibility for these restaurants that otherwise may not have sophisticated tracking of various things that they are doing. And so for those types of restaurant merchants, Uber provides different types of KPIs. So one of them is customer satisfaction, right? So a customer orders takeout and gets the food from Uber Eats, and then they may say, yeah, the food was great, 4 stars, or they may say, this particular chicken was awful, so 2 stars or 1 star. So they give you ratings, and they are basically giving you a way to say how good is your food, right? And what your feedback is, and if they had order issues and so on and so forth, right? So for example, I'm a vegetarian. I ordered a vegetarian dish and they gave me a chicken dish, then that's a problem, right? So they've got those types of things as to how satisfied the customers are. And obviously they also give you KPIs on sales and profitability. How much did you make and what type of dish seems to be selling the most and so on and so forth, right? And last is how effective is your marketing, right? If you have come up, you've revamped your website, and now you have menus that are much more attractive to look at. You can say how many people viewed your menus, how many of them are new customers who came in. If you had a promotion, did that spike your orders, and so on and so forth, right? Whether you did that. So these are think about your constituents of Uber Eats, right? These are essentially, a lot of them could be mom and pop restaurants that are local, and they may not have that sophistication in terms of their KPIs and so on. And so Uber provides a way for to provide those types of insights and visibility, so that if you are a restaurant owner, you can be smarter about what is it that you're looking at. And if certain dishes go extremely well, you may want to think about, doubling down on it, or you may think about raising the price and so on and so forth, right? So those are all things that you look at. And let me pause again before we get into the final topic, which is the process, if there are any questions.
Nuevamente una pausa por si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta. Es el momento antes de entrar a la última etapa de la clase. Hernán. Germán, perdón.
Sí, profesor, en estos negocios que son competitivos, siempre van a coexistir en el ambiente indicadores que son operativos, de resultado inmediato y también estratégicos.
The question for the student is in this kind of industries that are very competitive, the KPIs are lying and leaning also. They are a combination of that. What is your opinion?
Yeah, it's not so much you want to track KPIs that are important to you, right? So your company. So for example, if let's say I'm in a restaurant, like you said, it's a highly competitive business, right? And so I may have some differentiating. Go back to what I was talking about in terms of your, value proposition, right? What is different about your restaurant compared to other restaurants out there? So, for example, if I'm a pizza maker, how is my pizza different? Maybe it's got to do with my toppings, maybe it's got to do with my crust, or maybe it has got to do with the fact that I can deliver within 20 minutes, and if I don't deliver within 20 minutes, you get it free, right? It could be any of those. So what you now want to find out is what is the most thing that you are interested in, and so your KPI is going to be about that particular thing that you're tracking. So let's continue with this example, and let's say that 20 minutes thing is what I'm interested in. So one of the things I want to now, my KPIs should be, one is lagging, to say, what is my average delivery time for the last 1 month, right? So from the time I ordered and from the time I got it, what is the average delivery time? The leading indicator, for example, in this could be that, and this is a hypothesis, I have to prove it, right? You always want to form a hypothesis. And your hypothesis may be that if the number of orders increase within a particular span, chances are I may not be able to deliver the 20-minute thing. So then my leading indicator becomes number of orders within a timeline. And so that becomes, if I know that that's going to go up, I know that I may have a problem with it. So either I now need to look at more people or more ovens or whatever the solution is. But the idea here is you decide what your KPIs are. Your KPIs for your pizza shop might be different for somebody else's KPI in a different pizza company because their focus or emphasis could be different, right? So that's how you want to think about KPIs. Did that answer the question, Herman?
Okay, teacher. Good, good.
All right. Any other question before we sort of move to the last topic?
Let me see the chat. No, we don't have more questions, Professor.
Okay, great. So the last topic is all about, I mentioned to you about how you want to understand what your current processes are. If you don't really understand your current processes, it's very difficult for you to figure out what you need to change and how to get to a to-be state, right? And so process diagrams in general give you a very visual representation of business processes, workflows, system interactions, and so on and so forth. And what you can do is you can identify where your inefficiencies are, your bottlenecks are in your process. And you can sort of think about how you can improve that. You can also identify where your automation opportunities are or optimization opportunities are. And so you can use different tools that are out there. There is a popular one called business process model and notation. There are flowcharts out there that you can do. There are what are called swim lanes, excuse me, and value stream maps. And there are lots of different ways to do it. But You can pick any one of these, and the easier and simpler you can use, the better off you are. Because one of the things you want to do is you want to communicate, use this as a communication mechanism. Once you have something saying, this is our process, everybody can look at it and say, oh my goodness, you know what, you think that's the process, but we actually do it this way, right? In reality. So you can start seeing the gap between what people understand their process to be and what in real life it actually is. And this is not that uncommon. A lot of times, a lot of companies think that they operate in a certain way and find out that once they actually put all these things together, they find out that that's not really the case, right? So it's actually it's a good vehicle for communication with your stakeholders and everybody else. And what I thought I would do is a very simple illustration, but it'll give you a sense of how typical process diagrams look like, right? Think about I'm at a cafe, or going back to the cafe thing, and people can order either a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And so it starts with the customer arriving. And sometimes the customer may have to wait before they can place an order, right? This is an opportunity for you, like I was giving you that example at airports, where I may have to wait for 20 minutes before I can get to the order. That's an opportunity for us to say, how can I make it better if that's one of my objectives, right? So the customer comes in, they wait, and then they place an order. Sometimes they wait hardly any wait, or sometimes they wait for quite some time. Now, once they place an order, they wait again, right? Because somebody has to prepare whatever it is that they've ordered. So the customer again waits out here. That's your wait. But what happens is once they place an order, somebody receives the order and the money that you have to pay. And now I have to have a decision point, which is, what did they order? Did they order coffee or did they order tea? Because depending on what they ordered, I may have to take them to a coffee station or a tea station. So typically, when you see a diamond in any business process notation, that is typically into what is called a decision-making point, right? So you are going to now split into different points. And what it can also do is that these two things can operate in parallel. It doesn't have to be sequential. So I can send a tea guy to a tea order to a tea station, can send a coffee order to a coffee station, and they both can be operating at the same time, right? Remember that this is just view of one order, but I could have orders at all points in time, right? And then what happens is the customer is waiting, and then they receive the beverage and then they leave. So it's a very simple thing, but imagine what you can do. And now there are actually software programs that take a crack at it by looking at your log files, right? So one of the things is that nowadays a lot of these things get done by systems. Systems write their different logs to different files, and so there are software programs now that can read these logs and actually generate a visual for you for a process diagram, and then you can use that as a starting point and then get going. But it is a useful thing to do because you want to really understand your current state. As we move further into digital transformation concepts, we'll talk about how we are going to move from one to the other, and so it is good to understand what your current state is, and you can understand where your bottlenecks are. So you can measure these things and say, in our process, it looks like the average wait time of a customer is 3 minutes. And so you may start losing customers in your cafe because the waiting time is too long. So you now have to address that, right? So measuring these things and clearly understanding your process helps you with those types of things to get insight into what is it that is going on, right? And that sort of brings us to the end of the topics. But what I want you to sort of think about, you don't have to do it today, you don't have to do it now. Obviously, I'll open it for questions, but would strongly encourage you to take a crack at a company that you know very well in Chile or whatever it is, and think and spend some time trying to figure out what do you think is their business model. Use the canvas and try to fill all those 9 squares out there. And once you do that, think about their value proposition. Has it evolved over time? What do you think are the competitive forces? How do they do it? Which particular threat is higher, you think? And then what do you think are some of their KPIs? So I'll pause here for questions. Hope you found the lecture helpful. And I would strongly urge you to do a little bit of reflection. And if you have questions while you're doing the reflection, you're more than welcome to shoot me an email, and we can communicate that way. And so I'll pause here now, Professor Juan, and see if there are any questions.
Ok, perfecto. A ver, no sé, hay espacio también para ver si hay algún tipo de pregunta al cierre de la sesión y alguna pregunta en relación a la actividad. Recordad que esto no es una actividad para hacerla ahora, sino para trabajarla durante quizás la semana, ¿no?
Yo tengo una pregunta.
Ok, Ignacio,
Sí, bueno, voy a tratar de hacerla en inglés. No sé si
dale.
se me entiende mucho. Eh, bueno, while I reading the material and studying, I ask me the next question. Eh, should the ethical factor be involved in the creation of business model, or does that take a secondary roles and not considered value? For example, when we replace the human factor in favor of lowering cost, I shouldn't consider an ethical limit in my decision.
That's a great question. So, it depends on what we talk about when we say ethical, right? So absolutely, yes. And I would say that ethics is something that every company should do on all aspects, right? But I want to be clear about what we talk about when we talk about ethics, especially when we talk about technologies like AI and so on and so forth, right? The question I would ask is, based on what you're talking about, replacement of humans and loss of jobs and all that, and I, agree that it is devastating for people who lose their job. But if you are saying that, I don't want people to lose their jobs, then what I would say is the answer is not to use technology, because if you don't use technology, you're going to be left behind. So the answer to that is that you disrupt the business, but retrain your people for the types of jobs that they may not have anticipated or you may not have anticipated. So that's definitely something that you want to look at. But not all companies do that. They're looking at it from a profitability perspective, and that's okay. But where I think it becomes really important is I teach that even when I teach some AI to some of the students, is if you are using, let's say, a technology like AI, and you are in the loan providing business, and you use the algorithm to find out, AI algorithm to find out whether a particular person is worthy of a loan or not, and your algorithm was done with data that only has certain demographics, then what the algorithm will do is it will only give loans to those demographics that were in the training data, right? Chances are it will probably ignore it. So if your training data predominantly had Caucasians and not many African Americans or Asians, and they keep getting rejected, then you know that you've got a bias in your algorithm, and ethically that's incorrect. So in other words, there are different ethics. To me, is not black and white, unfortunately. Sometimes it becomes a very difficult ethical decision, but it's a continuum. And you have to keep that in mind all the time. So whether you're talking about business models, I mean, you're doing an analysis of the business model. So what you may want to do there is you may want to say, I've got a revenue stream that is ethically not right, then I would say don't use that as a revenue stream, right? So, but it needs to be pervasive, not just for the business model, but how you operate your entire organization. Did that answer the question, Ignacio?
Yes, thank you.
Bueno,
Any
la
other?
Quisiera dar como mi opinión sobre eso. En realidad, si no les molesta, no sé si hay algún problema en opinar.
No, dale, continúa.
Sí, mira, para mí el tener la tecnología, sea cual sea, nunca va a ser un problema de ética si es que esto afecta a las personas con las que trabajo. De partida, si tú tienes una herramienta que te permite trabajar más rápido, es una herramienta que tienes que aprender simplemente. Si hay una persona que no quiere aprender y en realidad eso te perjudica en la facilidad con la que puedes trabajar, es un problema no de la empresa, sino de la persona. Pues por eso que, por ejemplo, si en la antigüedad no hubiéramos querido utilizar el computador porque queríamos hacer todo en papel, no tiene ningún sentido en la actualidad, porque ya lo ves, no es un problema de la persona, en el sentido de querer echarla porque sí. De hecho, si tuviéramos una empresa y tuviéramos inversión para poder avanzar en ella, sería poco ético también desgastarse tratando de hacer todo a mano y utilizar más dinero, si al final lo podemos hacer mucho más rápido y mucho más ágil. O sea, no habría por qué no utilizarlo. No veo que sea un tema ético.
Professor, you need to translate all the comment? Or...
Yes, I
Yes?
do.
Okay. It's a little bit long, but I want to try. The student said that the digital transformation was not a problem. It's a capability to transform the organization and make the opportunity to the people or collaborate or associate to train and make another ability or quality to perform. He said that it's not an ethical question, it's a performance or maybe evolution process question. He said that it's not an ethical decision, it's a evolution decision, no? That's a resume.
Yeah.
A resume.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so if you think about transformation, you're doing it. You're doing it for a couple of things, right? You're doing it because the market has shifted, the customers have different expectations, and so you're forced to transform and continue to evolve and do that. I would argue it's unethical to not do so for your own employees because you're going to get out of business if you don't do that, right? So yes, it is not about ethics, but it's about evolution. But what I'm saying about ethics is that it's an integral part of the fabric of the culture of the organization. And so you can't just turn off some ethical points in certain times of your transformation, turn it back on type of thing, right? It's an integral part of that fabric of a culture of an organization. And invariably, those with strong ethical principles will navigate these types of challenges better than those who try to be unethical in certain things. So it is not about whether it is ethical or a process discussion, but ethics, and that's a completely separate course maybe, and we can have a different discussion, but ethics is sort of an integral fabric of a culture of an organization. Hope that sort of delineates and differentiates.
Okay. Thanks, Professor. I think that we are in time now.
Yeah.
A lot of students have another class. Thanks for your master class, for your presentation, and also the examples was very clear. I think that the next week we have a asynchronous class, and in 2 weeks we come back in this section, no?
Yes, yeah. I'm actually flying to India, so next week I'll record, and the following week I'll get up really early and give you the lecture. Yes.
Okay. Have a nice trip. A nice
Okay.
trip. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. See you in 2 weeks, and thanks another.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Para todos, bueno, la próxima sección es una sección asíncrona. El profesor va a grabar la clase. En 2 semanas más nos volvemos a reencontrar aquí en este mismo link, en la misma sesión. Bien. Les mando un gran abrazo, que tengan una linda tarde. Cuídense mucho y buena semana.
Gracias.
Igualmente, hasta luego.
Chao, chao.
Profesor.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Bye, sir.
Thank you, professor.
Thank you, professor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, teacher. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, professor. Until next time.
All right.